Can I begin by saying how delighted and honoured I am to be opening this session to launch Ellie Christensen's second novel. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I will be following it online and cheering on Linda from afar. So, what does historical fiction mean to me? Answering the question, why do you write? Margaret Atwood suggested various reasons. Among them were to record the world as it is, and to set down the past before it is all forgotten, and to excavate the past because it has been forgotten. And this last one is the interesting one for me. There's a famous quote from the philosopher George Santayana who said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And they called the result of that a state of perpetual infancy. Edmund Burke said much the same thing much earlier. People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. Now, those quotes come from 1906 and 1790, so they are themselves now historical artefacts. When we quote them today, we are negotiating with the ghosts of the past. So we could justifiably ask, what can Edmund Burke, who lived through the French Revolution and the American Revolution, offer us by way of insight into our 21st century world? Although, having said that, since Burke is generally regarded as being the founder of the political philosophy of conservatism, and since he is someone who lived through the consequences of pandering to the mob, it would be genuinely fascinating to hear what he thought of Suella Braverman or Lee Anderson, or the lunatics who have captured the modern day Conservative Party. But that's by the by. Margaret Atwood continued, giving us more reasons to write, to hold a mirror up to nature, to hold a mirror up to the readers, to paint a portrait of society and its ills. And actually there were a number of other reasons Margaret Atwood suggested for why she writes, but I've ignored them. They didn't fit my purpose for this talk, so I just left them out. Now, is that right? In the interest of accuracy, should I have included them all? For example, she also wrote to help with my depression. Now, maybe that was more important to Margaret Atwood than any of her other reasons, and by missing that out, I'm misinterpreting her. Well, maybe. And if I was writing an academic treatise on Margaret Atwood, I would have to be scrupulously fair in how I interpreted her words. But I'm not. I'm a writer of historical fiction, and I use historical events for my purposes. Now, I'm not going to deliberately lie about what happened in the past. I'm not a revisionist historian with malign intent like David Irving. But I have ideas I wish to explore, and historical fiction is my means of doing that. So for me, historical fiction offers a window on the past and a door to the present. Walter Benjamin wrote in 1936, "Experience which is passed on from mouth to mouth is the source from which all storytellers are drawn." And Benjamin feared that the art of storytelling was being lost, and, in his words, the epic side of truth, wisdom, is dying out. In fact, Benjamin went on to suggest that the novel was part of the reason for this dying out. What distinguishes the novel from the story, he said, is its essential dependence on the book, the physical artefact. And he said, what can be handed on orally is of a different kind from what constitutes the stock and trade of the novel. The novel neither comes from oral tradition nor goes into it. As it happens, I don't agree with Benjamin on that point, but all the same, it does lead us towards a truth which is at the heart of why I write historical fiction. And that is the oral tradition of storytelling. Oral traditions long predate written stories because we learned to speak before we could write. And we see traditions throughout the world that are essentially oral in nature, whether that's the African griots or Scottish traveller people. One of my biggest influences is the Gaelic poet Sorley MacLean. Now, Sorley MacLean was from Raasay, and that place infused his work, its physical beauty, its history, and its people's personal recollections, all combined to create this distinctive Highland culture rooted in the Gaelic. For MacLean, the land and its people are deeply intertwined, and so are the past and the present. His greatest work is the poem Hallaig, a lament for the clearances of the Highlands and Islands in the 19th century. And in the poem he sees and hears those people still. They have become birch trees, a straight, slender young rowan. They are still in Hallaig, MacLeans and MacLeods, all who were there in the time of Machgilhallam. The dead have been seen alive. So we navigate our own histories all the time without even realising it. We deal with the ghosts of the past. And that phrase, the ghost of the past, comes from a poem by Thomas Hardy. And for me that poem has a double resonance, a double past. The poem itself is about the ghosts of the past, in Hardy's case his dead wife, and the pain that comes from gradually over time losing connection with those people, those areas of the past. The past, or at least your connection with it, becomes, in Hardy's words, a fitful, far-off skeleton, dimming as days draw by. Now, I love this poem, and I once wrote a truly terrible short story based on it. But that was probably 25 years ago now. So it's a poem about reconciling yourself with the past. But now my memory of that poem is in itself, in the past. I am not the man I was then. I am my own ghost, sifting through my own past. Now, back to Sorley MacLean. Sorley talked about reported or received history against oral or lived history, and how these two things can be often, possibly even mostly, not the same thing. He was very sceptical, in fact, about received history. The recollections of the cleared Highlanders, for example, or the Irish people fleeing famine, were very different from what you read in the history books. So where are their voices? And the simple truth is that a lot of history is silent. Denise Minor talks about the less dead, people like sex workers whose murders were deemed less important than those of decent women. And read anything on the Yorkshire Ripper murders and you'll understand how hideously true that is. But I would say there is also the missing dead, people whose voices are simply not there in historical record. And that's something that's very much at the heart of what I write. I come from a rural working class background. I've now lived in England far longer than I ever lived in Scotland, so I've largely lost my accent. But as a child I was a Scots speaker, more broad in fact than most of my peers. And I just don't hear those cadences and rhythms and idioms in the vast majority of literature. When things are written in Scots, it tends to be middle class. If it is working class, it tends to be urban. Irvine Welsh, Graham Armstrong, Douglas Stewart and so on. And if it is rural, it tends to be Kailyard, Ree McGregor and the like, glorifying this simpler way of life that just never existed. So my writing is my window on the past, and I write about rural working class people. So my mother and my father bide in their books. The generations connect, the traditions continue. Heraclitus said you can't step in the same stream twice. And that's true, but it's also false. The stream bears on. The same molecules exist in different combinations, new from old, handing down from posterity into eternity. My memories, my hopes, illusions, decisions, and all of them merging with yours, and yours, and yours, and yours, shaping something different, something new, something wonderful. Hamish Henderson gave us this sense of our communities thriving across generations when he said, "Maker, ye maun sing them. Tomorrow songs will flow free again, and new voices be born on the carrying stream." And so this carrying stream will bear us all, and our culture will survive, and our hopes will see the morning. And by focusing on that sense of community, the historical novel offers us a way into history that history books cannot, because historical fiction is centred on people and not events. It gives us not just truth, but emotional truth. Your story may be set in Roman Britain, revolutionary France, the wars of independence, or whenever, whatever, but they are, in essence, books about humanity. They try to make history real. Note, I say try to. This history we talk of is a slippery thing. A significant problem is that history, as Winston Churchill said, is written by the victors. Except he didn't actually say that. He did say something similar, but so did lots of people, Hermann Goering included. It's one of those sayings that you can find examples of everywhere. It's essentially a truism, so there are examples galore. But history records that it was Churchill that said it. So we're presented with this quandary. What is history? Hilary Mantel said, "History is not the past. It's the method we have evolved of organising our ignorance of the past. It's what's left in the sieve when the centuries have run through it. A few stones, scraps of writing, scraps of cloth. It's no more the past than a birth certificate is a birth, or a script is a performance, or a map is a journey. It's the multiplication of the evidence of fallible and biased witnesses, combined with incomplete accounts of actions not fully understood by the people who performed them. It's no more than the best we can do, and often it falls short of that." So history then is little more than a scaffold, and historical novelists use it to navigate a way into the past and understand it from our present perspective. A great example of this is another Ringwood book published by Ringwood, What You Call Free by Flora Johnson. It's set in the late 17th century, in the time of the Covenanters. Now, if you read the history books about that time, you'd be forgiven for thinking that women hadn't been invented yet, because they just barely feature. In Flora's novel, the action revolves around two women, one of whom had the double misfortune of being born both female and poor in a society that privileged wealth and testicles. That character, Jonnet, would have had no voice, no agency at that time. So in reality, her voice is not carried through the centuries into our day. She is one of our missing dead. But Flora brings her to life and tells us her story in a way that no history book ever could. Our principal speaker today is Linda Christensen, and Linda has embarked on an ambitious and exciting series of novels which take us back into the very early period of history, the wars of independence in the early 13th century. So we're in what's pejoratively termed the Dark Ages. There's this completely false narrative about that period, that there was no civilization, everyone was living in hovels, culture and politics and society were debased and brutish. And that's not the case. Linda brings this out brilliantly in her books, and we get this extraordinary sense of time and place, of the high politics of that period, and of a burgeoning sense of nationhood in Scotland, which would play out over the centuries to follow, and which is still one of the vital issues of our modern age. So what Linda's doing then, very skillfully, and not in any dogmatic or didactic way, is to use history to help us negotiate our present day controversies. The historical novel not only is a window into the past then, but as a door into the present. We understand today by interrogating the past. I made a throwaway comment earlier about Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson and the Conservative Party flirting with populism, but actually it wasn't a throwaway remark. In a way, it's the essence of this talk, and it's the one thing that I want to stress and that I'm going to finish with. Christopher Isherwood's Goodbye to Berlin, or Günter Grass's The Tin Drum, can show us what Germany and Danzig were like in the 1930s, the ease with which they slid into fascist dictatorship. In that, they are windows on the past, but more importantly, they are doors to the present, if we are brave enough to open that door and step through it. Or, like Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson, we can choose to keep that door closed and instead remain perpetual infants. So, thank you all very much for listening to me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's session, and I do hope you'll all buy a copy of Linda's brilliant new book. So thank you very much, and over to you, Linda.